Welcome to Auntie's Sermons, the podcast. I'm your auntie and your host, Crystal J. I write, perform, and produce every episode as we go chronologically and methodically through the Bible, giving a sermon to every girl or girls, woman or women, named or unnamed. For far too long, the men have had the microphone. Around here, we're asking them to step aside while the women finally get to tell their stories. So grab yourself something to drink, get comfortable, and let's dive into the lives of the women of the Bible, one sermon at a time. Today, we're talking about a woman whose entire life is summarized by a transaction. She's handed from one person to another. Her body is used to produce children, and those children become tribes of Israel. Their names are remembered. Hers barely is. This episode isn't just about Zilpah. It's about what happens when a human being becomes a resource. When a woman can be called a wife and still be treated like property. When history celebrates what comes from her while forgetting the person herself. By the time we're finished, I think you'll understand why I chose to call this episode Saint Zilpah. Genesis 29:24. Laban gave Zilpah his servant to his daughter Leah for a servant. This is how Zilpah enters the Bible. And at this point in Genesis, the plot is so repetitive, it's almost boring. Another woman, another transfer, another body moved from one set of hands to another. She enters the way furniture enters a room, the way livestock enters a household. She is given. Before we know her story, before we know her body will bear sons, before tribes will rise from her womb, the text tells us exactly where she stands in the moral order. She is property. And the Hebrew makes that unmistakably clear. The word translated here as maid is shifah. It does not mean helper. It does not mean servant in the modern sense. It means a female slave, owned, transferable, without legal autonomy. This is not metaphorical slavery. This is not symbolic service. This is chattel slavery. The text is not confused about this. It does not soften it. It does not explain it. It simply assumes it. Before Zilpah is a mother, before she is useful, before she produces anything of value, the Bible introduces her as someone who can be given away. Her name. The Bible gives us her name and then refuses to explain it. That alone should make us pause, because when the Bible likes a woman's name, it tells us why. When it wants us to feel something about a name, it slows down. But Zilpah's name is dropped into the story and abandoned. When we turn to the Hebrew, it doesn't get better. Classical Hebrew lexicons associate her name with meanings like drooping, weak, frail. Words about the body, words about failure to stand upright. Frankly, the possible meanings of her name read like a list of insulting adjectives. Not wisdom, not beauty, not strength, just physical diminishment. Droopy? Really? And when you read that, you start to realize something uncomfortable. The text does not just enslave her body, it labels it. She is named in a way that prepares the reader not to care. Wife or slave. Now here is where the text creates a problem it never resolves. After establishing Zilpah as enslaved, the text then tells us something else. Genesis says she is given to Jacob as a wife. That matters. In Jewish tradition, wife is not nothing. Wife is status. Wife is legitimacy. Wife is supposed to mean protection, standing, recognition. But watch what the text does next. After calling her a wife, it never treats her like one. From that moment on, she is not remembered as Jacob's wife. She is not spoken of independently. She is not elevated. Instead, the text keeps calling her Leah's maid over and over again. even after she bears sons, even after those sons are fully legitimate, even after those sons become tribes. She is a wife in name and a slave in memory. And that tension is not accidental, because in the ancient Near East, wife was not a single category. It was a hierarchy. There were primary wives, secondary wives, slave wives, wives taken for alliance, wives taken for labor, wives taken for reproduction, and all of them could legally be called wife. But not all wives were protected. Not all wives had status. Not all wives were remembered. Some wives existed for one purpose only: to produce. Zilpah is that kind of wife. She is used as a breeder. A wife whose body is upgraded just enough to legitimize children, but whose person is never upgraded at all. Her sons rise. Her status freezes. She is not treated like Leah. She is not treated like Rachel. She is not even treated like a remembered wife. She is treated like an incubator with a legal label. And the text is comfortable with that. Every time Zilpah appears. Zilpah is mentioned only a handful of times in the entire Bible. Here's every verse where she is mentioned. Genesis 29:24. Laban gave Zilpah his servant to his daughter Leah for a servant. When Leah saw that she had finished bearing, she took Zilpah, her servant, and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Genesis 30:10-11. Zilpah, Leah's servant, bore Jacob a son. Leah said, "How fortunate!" She named him Gad. Genesis 30:12-13. Zilpah, Leah's servant, bore Jacob a son. Leah said, "Happy am I, for the daughters will call me happy." She named him Asher. Genesis 35:26. The sons of Zilpah, Leah's servant, Gad and Asher, these are the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Padan Aram. Zilpah's story, a synopsis. Zilpah enters the biblical story as an enslaved woman owned by Laban. She is given to Leah. Later, she is given again to Jacob. The text calls this second transfer a marriage. Zilpah does not speak. She is not consulted. She is not asked. She bears two sons for Jacob. Leah names them. Leah explains what they mean. Leah receives the social benefit. Zilpah's body produces children who will become tribes of Israel. Her sons are counted as fully legitimate. Their names are remembered. Their descendants matter. Zilpah herself is never elevated. God never speaks to her. No one asks how this costs her. She is never remembered as a wife. Even after bearing sons, even after those sons become tribes, the text continues to identify her only as Leah's maid. Her story begins with ownership. It ends with a label. And what should trouble us most is not just what happens to Zilpah, but how familiar this pattern will become. A woman's body is used to bring something sacred into the world. The outcome is celebrated. The woman is forgotten. This will not be the last time the Bible tells a story like this. Rabbinic teaching and the silence around Zilpah. When we turn to rabbinic teaching, we might expect something to change. Sometimes the rabbis argue with the text. Sometimes they soften it. Sometimes they rescue women the Bible leaves exposed. But with Zilpah, that doesn't happen. Rabbinic tradition notices her only when it has to. She appears when lineage needs explaining. She appears when the sons need legitimizing. She appears when tribal math requires an origin story. But she is never treated as a moral problem. The rabbis explain Leah. They justify the strategy. They protect the sons. They preserve the structure. Zilpah herself is not questioned. Her consent is not discussed. Her suffering is not examined. Her elevation is never imagined. Even when the text calls her a wife, rabbinic tradition quietly returns her to where she started, Leah's maid, a means to an end. This is not because Zilpah didn't matter, but because actually taking her seriously would have forced the tradition to question who gets power, who gets inheritance, and whose bodies are allowed to be used without consequence. Christian teaching when usefulness becomes holy. When we move from the biblical text into Christian teaching, something changes, not the facts, the framing. Christian teaching rarely lingers on Zilpah herself. It lingers on what came from her. God built Israel anyway. God worked through broken family systems. God brought good out of a bad situation. Zilpah's suffering fades into the background while the outcome takes center stage. This is how Christianity often deals with horrific events in the Bible. The question is never, should this have happened? The question is always, why did God do it? And once that question is accepted, the devastation no longer matters. The violence doesn't matter. The coercion doesn't matter. The woman doesn't matter, because it all supposedly works toward God's greater good. But there's no good reason to rape a woman. There's no holy justification for violating a body. There's no divine excuse that makes exploitation acceptable. Not even a bloodline, especially not a bloodline. And this is where the logic completely collapses, because Zilpah's sons do not lead to the Messiah. The Bible never presents Gad or Asher as necessary to the central plot. They are not required for salvation history. They are not essential to redemption. They are not required at all. Which means Zilpah's suffering cannot even be defended by the argument Christianity reaches for most often. She is not violated for the Messiah. She is violated for structure, for continuity, for tribal math. Christian teaching still insists on calling this meaningful, still insists on calling it necessary, still insists on calling it God working through brokenness. But when the outcome is not redemption and the cost is a woman's body, what remains is not mystery. It is utilitarianism. Zilpah is not condemned. She is simply absorbed. Her body becomes a means. Her experience becomes irrelevant. Her exploitation is reframed as participation in something sacred. And this way of telling the story should feel familiar, because Christianity loves this storytelling style. Women are a prop to move the story along from Zilpah to Mary. Their bodies used as incubators, and it is seen as holy. Zilpah and Mary, the same structure. Before we compare women, we need to compare systems, because this is not about personalities. It is about how bodies are used. Zilpah's body is used to advance what the text calls God's plan, not redemption, not salvation, continuity. Her body stabilizes a household. Her womb solves a problem. Order is preserved. Mary's body is also used to advance what Christianity calls God's plan. This time it is salvation. This time it is redemption. This time the stakes are cosmic. Different outcomes, same mechanism. In both stories, a woman's body becomes the means by which something sacred enters the world. The plan moves forward through her flesh. The theology celebrates the result. The cost of the woman fades into the background. That is the pattern. Now, let's talk about consent. Zilpah's consent is never mentioned. She is enslaved. Consent is structurally impossible. Her availability is assumed. Mary's consent is emphasized. An angel speaks. A question is asked. A response is given. And Christians point to that response as proof of righteousness, of obedience, of faith. But consent does not exist in a vacuum. Mary is a young girl, a child by every social and legal standard of her world, and children cannot give consent. Even before we talk about angels or prophecy, a child cannot meaningfully consent to what is being asked of her. And even if Mary had been an adult, the power imbalance would still make true consent impossible. This is not equals speaking. This is not negotiation. This is God and human. An infinite authority confronting a finite person. A future declared, not offered. A role assigned, not chosen from alternatives. So the question is not whether Mary understood what was happening. The question is whether she understood that saying no was never truly an option. And that brings us to the word she chooses when Mary turns to the angel and says, I am the Lord's servant. But that word does not mean servant. In Greek, Mary calls herself a doule, a female slave, a bondwoman, someone who belongs to someone else. And this is where we need to be honest about what Mary is doing. Mary is not diminishing herself because she lacks worth. She is naming reality. She understands the imbalance. She understands the hierarchy. She understands that resistance is not on the table. Calling herself a slave is not confusion. It is clarity. It is the language of someone who knows there is no meaningful way to refuse the God of the universe. Zilpah is called a slave by the text. Mary calls herself one. Two women, two bodies, two plans said to come from God, and both are framed using the same logic: availability, obedience, and the surrender of self. And we should not rush past that word. Mary does not have to call herself a slave. She could have said servant. She could have said follower. She could have said chosen, but she doesn't. She reaches for the most accurate word she has. I am the Lord's slave. So we have to ask why women learn this language so fluently. Why submission feels like realism, why acceptance feels like wisdom, why survival gets mistaken for holiness. And this is where the conversation stops being ancient and starts being painfully familiar. Because this is not the only time a young person shaped by religious belief has understood that compliance was the safest option available. Before we go any further, we need to talk about someone who lived this in real time, someone whose story helps us understand how belief can reshape how a person understands harm and how reclaiming yourself can take years. Her name is Elizabeth Smart. Elizabeth Smart, belief, survival, and reclaiming the self. Before we go any further, I need to say this clearly. The next part of this sermon references kidnapping and sexual violence. I will not be graphic, but I will be honest. If you need to step away or take a break, please do so. Elizabeth Smart did not grow up on the margins. She grew up in a loving, stable home, a religious home. She was raised in a devout Latter-day Saint family, surrounded by faith, structure, and moral teaching. She was taught obedience. She was taught modesty. She was taught that virtue was something you guarded. She was taught that goodness was tied to purity. And in the religious culture she grew up in, there was a message, sometimes explicit, sometimes implied, that it was better to die than to lose your virtue. That teaching mattered. It shaped how girls understood their bodies. It shaped how they understood worth. And it shaped what survival was allowed to look like. Elizabeth Smart was 14 years old when she was kidnapped from her bedroom. A man entered her home in the middle of the night, threatened her family, and took her away. For 9 months, Elizabeth Smart was held captive. She was repeatedly abused. She was isolated. She was controlled through fear, coercion, and religious manipulation. And years later, when Elizabeth began to speak publicly, she explained something that made people deeply uncomfortable. During her captivity, she believed she was ruined. That once her purity was taken, she was no longer worth saving. That escape no longer mattered. That resistance no longer made sense. Those beliefs did not come from her captor. They came from the religious messages she had absorbed long before the kidnapping. Obedience became survival. Compliance became safety. Endurance became the only option that felt morally available. Elizabeth has been very clear about this. She was not consenting. She was coping. She was doing what people do when refusal feels impossible and survival feels like the only remaining moral choice. And it took years after her rescue to unlearn the idea that what was done to her defined who she was. It took years to reclaim her body as her own, her voice as her own, her worth as something that had never been lost. Elizabeth Smart did not become strong because of what happened to her. She became strong by rejecting the belief systems that told her she was already gone. And this is why her story belongs here. Not because her experience is the same as Mary's, it is not, but because it helps us understand something essential: how belief can reshape how a person understands harm, how obedience can feel like the only righteous response, and how accepting a role does not mean that role was freely chosen. Elizabeth Smart shows us that survival can look like surrender, and that reclaiming yourself often begins with rejecting the language that once kept you alive. And when we return to Mary's words, "I am the Lord's slave," we are no longer hearing blind faith. We are hearing a young person accurately naming a situation where refusal did not feel possible. And that should change how we tell these stories. And before we close, we have to come back to Zilpah, because this story was never really about Mary, and it was never really about Elizabeth Smart. It was about her. Elizabeth Smart did not consent. She was a captive. Mary did not consent. She names herself accurately. She understands the imbalance she is standing inside of. And Zilpah was never even given the dignity of being asked. Elizabeth Smart was held captive. Mary names herself captive, and Zilpah is named captive by the text itself. In Hebrew, Zilpah is called a shifha, a female slave, property, transferable, owned. In Greek, Mary calls herself a doule, a female slave, a bondwoman, someone who belongs to someone else. Different languages, same word, same logic. And Zilpah is given the title of wife, but she is treated exactly as what the text already decided she was: a shifah, a woman whose body existed to produce. Elizabeth Smart survives and reclaims herself. Mary is exalted and remembered, but Zilpah, no one paints her. No one builds statues of her. No one places her on a front lawn with a bathtub over her head. No one prays to her. No one calls her holy. The text diminishes her. Tradition forgets her. The system uses her and moves on. And writing this sermon has made something painfully clear to me. I do not believe free will exists anywhere in Scripture, and I most certainly do not believe it exists for women. Not then, and not now. Because when free will does not exist, what gets called obedience is often just survival. What gets called faith is often just adaptation. What gets called holiness is often just learning the language of captivity. Women are still giving themselves the title of slave. You can say it in Hebrew, shifah. You can say it in Greek, doule. You can say it from the pulpit and call it beautiful. But Elizabeth Smart teaches us something else. She shows us that what was done to you does not get to name you. What you endured does not define you. What a system needed from your body does not determine your worth. Zilpah is not what the text says she is. She is not property. She is not a breeder. She is not drooping. She is not weak. They diminished her. I will not. Zilpah is a mother of Israel. Zilpah is a survivor. Zilpah endured a system that never intended to honor her. And if sainthood means bearing unbearable things without becoming what the system said you were, then if there ever was a saint, it was Zilpah. And that's today's anti-sermon. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to like, comment, rate, or review the podcast. It really helps more people find the show. And if you'd like to support the podcast financially, check out my link tree in the show notes. There are several ways you can support the show and the work that I do. You can also find me on TikTok and YouTube. I am Crystal J, Crystaljae. And remember, I'm Nice Lady.